you may have seen there was a headline in the Telegraph saying that Poland will be wealthier than Britain by 2030. And so on this path, they're on their way, if trends continue, to overtaking, historically the wealthiest country in the world, right?
Hello and welcome back to the Realities of Socialism podcast. I'm Rosemarie Fike, your host, and in this episode, I am joined once again by Dr. Matthew Mitchell. Matthew Mitchell is a senior fellow in the Center for Economic Freedom at the Fraser Institute and an affiliated senior fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, as well as a senior research affiliate at the Knee Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation at West Virginia University. In part one of our conversation, Matt and I talked about Poland's experience under socialism, what factors led them to attempt this experiment with socialism, and what problems they had to face while under that system. And in this part of the conversation, we're going to talk more about Poland's transition from socialism back to a more market-oriented economy. If you haven't listened to part one, I highly recommend going back and checking that out for context before listening to this episode. But of course, come back when you are done. Matt, thank you again for joining me. So we've been down the road to socialism with Poland. Let's come back again. Tell me a little bit about when Poland started taking steps to transition to more market-oriented institutions. Were there some specific events? Were there key people that played a role in this transition?
Yeah, so in some ways, it's so interesting to look at this history because it looks inevitable, from our standpoint. Like, of course, communism was going to fail, but in late socialist societies, it looked anything but inevitable. There. Not only did it seem that the state was willing to spend, enormous amounts of money to make sure that there was no military challenge to them, but they also were even willing to use it whenever people had tried to, break free or show some independence. As the Czechoslovakians, just to take one example, famously found out in 1968. So. By the 70s and 60s and 70s, there were certainly fewer true believers in Poland, and probably a lot fewer true believers even in the top of the Kremlin. But it didn't look like this was going to end well, right? So the economies were starting to stagnate. In Poland, they had shifted course a little bit, and after decades of trying to throttle personal consumption, they had this idea that the way that they could outdo the West was to industrialize quickly, and the way they could do that was to make sure that workers didn't consume much, and so they would channel as much as they could into savings and therefore investment. And this is how they built so many factories. By the 70s, the populace had gotten so wary of that and were aware of the gap in the material prosperity with the West, that they really, the planners felt obliged to try to permit more consumption. Unfortunately, when they did this, they permitted more consumption, but they didn't have the productive capabilities to actually allow it. And so they had to borrow like crazy, and they borrowed a lot from the West. And so the socialist countries began racking up these huge debts, and they began doing what Adam Smith called the juggling act, which is you rack up debts and deficits, and in order to pay your debts, you monetize the debt, and that leads to inflation. And so they then started having this problem of rampant inflation. Now, interestingly enough, it was not inflation in the official prices. It was inflation in the black market, but people were willing to pay those high prices in the black market. Okay, so you've got all that sort of going on economically. At the same time, you do have a shift in leadership in the Soviet Union. even from Stalin to Khrushchev, that was important. So Stalin dies in March of 1953. Eventually, Khrushchev, through a coup, consolidates power. And then in 1956, Khrushchev makes the secret speech, the infamous secret speech. It was kind of like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It was the least worst kept secret. The only people who were allowed to know it were members of the party, and they were like allowed to take it and then read it and then give it back. One member of the party, and so in the secret speech, he denounces Stalin and is open about all of the murderous consequences of the Stalinist regime. The consequences of the secret speech reach Poland faster than anywhere else because the leader of Poland, Boleslaw Bierut, reads an early copy of the speech and promptly has a heart attack and dies. And so Bierut is then replaced with Gomulka, who has, like Khrushchev, a much more moderate approach. So throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s, you start to see a little bit more moderate approach and loosening of the control problem, but you still have the knowledge problem and the incentive problem, and the socialist states just still can't produce. So you kind of just, they sort of get into this sort of steady stagnation, and then you get inflation. Okay, so now 1978, a big key moment is the Catholic Church surprises everybody and selects a Polish priest as the new pope. So John Paul II is now the leader of the Catholic Church. The Soviets and the new Polish leader have committed themselves to more openness. And so when the Catholic Church says, when the Catholic Pope says, I want to come visit my home country, they kind of have no choice. They got to let him. So he visits Poland in 1979, June 1979. And he's like a rock star. He is greeted by everybody there when these big throngs of enthusiastic supporters. And he's very careful. He challenges the regime, but he does it in a very careful way. He simply says 3 words: be not afraid. And in saying that, he really was emboldening the Poles to start to assert themselves. Okay. So now the next important stage in this story begins with a worker. So remember, of course, Marx, says that workers are going to decide that they have nothing to lose but their chains, and they're going to rise up against the socialist system or the capitalist system. Ironically, it was the workers who decided they had nothing to lose but their chains and rose up in revolt against the socialist system. And the first step is a woman named Anna Walentynowicz. And she was a woman who had previously been praised as a Stakhanovite shock worker by the Soviet system and by the Polish Communist Party as somebody who she was such a hard worker. She was sort of considered the epitome of the socialist ideal. Well, as it turns out, Anna also had a very strong sense of social justice. And so when she saw her boss stealing money, she did what she thought, she should do, and she reported it. She was rewarded for her honesty by being fired. She was so well liked in her factory that they organized a strike, and the strike spread and spread and spread. Meanwhile, she teams up with a young, charismatic electrician named Lech Walesa to form a group called Solidarity. And this ends up being, it's a trade union. It ends up being the first significant, or actually I think it's the first only non-state organized trade union throughout the Soviet sphere. And within a year, this is extraordinary to me, 1/3 of Poles were members of Solidarity. So it's just very, very successful. Now, they take their name, by the way, also from a phrase that the Pope had used during his 1979 visit. Okay, so this is early 80s. The Poles, especially the workers, are sort of rising up. And the Polish state doesn't exactly know how to react. And they decide to react the way that they had earlier in the regime, and quite forcefully. So it's called the Long December Night. It happened in December 1981, December 13th, 1981, the leader declares martial law. Thousands of people were arrested. 140,000 armed men are sent into the street. 200,000 Poles end up being fined. 10,000 are arrested, and 3,500 are imprisoned. One railway worker blew the whistle on his railroad in support of the Solidarity movement for 60 seconds. And as a result of that 60-second show of defiance, he spent 2 years in prison. So they go and they arrest Walentynowicz, and they arrest Lech Walesa. And when they come for Walesa, he says, "This is the moment of your defeat. This is the last nail in the coffin of communism. You've overreached." Prophetic words. At the time, they probably look like inaccurate words, because for the next 7 years, kind of nothing happened, 6 or 7 years. But the next big change is Gorbachev. So Gorbachev comes to power in the Soviet Union. He promises a lot. He promises reform, which he called perestroika. He promises openness, which he called glasnost. Openness does become very important for other countries like Estonia, because they could openly talk about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But the biggest change for Poland is that he renounces what's known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Now, since 1968, the Soviets had threatened to invade any country that looked like it was going to abandon communism or even soften communism. He renounces this doctrine and withdraws 500,000 troops in December of 1987 from Poland. The withdrawal of troops suddenly opens things up to make it so that Poles can determine their own destiny. And so that's kind of the long political history. Eventually, Lech Walesa ends up becoming the president of Poland. So you get, pretty significant change in power. The next part of the economic history is a man named Leszek Balcerowicz becomes the Minister of Finance, and he ends up pushing through, pretty much supported by all political parties, quite significant and ambitious reforms. So I'll end it there, because that was a long answer to your short question.
Yeah, no, one of the things that you do mention, in addition to the Pope's visit and the role of solidarity, you do mention that slight increases in exposure to markets that happened during the 1970s was another factor that really undermined the socialist system there. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So again, this is part of this idea of, okay, well, we tried throttling consumption, and that still seems to be leading to worker unrest and occasional riots and occasional violence. So maybe let's try a more conciliatory measure. You could even trace this all the way back to when Khrushchev famously debated Nixon during what are called the kitchen debates. The two countries had sponsored displays in each other's country. So the Soviets created a display in New York City where they had extolling all of the achievements of the Soviet space program. And the Americans built a display in Moscow that simply just showed an American kitchen. And in it, you see all the appliances that American consumers were able to access. And sort of touring this kitchen with Nixon, Khrushchev says, and he pledges, we're going to outproduce the Americans, and we're going to allow our people to outconsume the Americans. So they stopped throttling consumption, but the only way to do this in large part was to import Western-made goods. And so Poles in the 70s, especially as the state was going into great debt in order to permit them to do this, were allowed to import goods from the West. And so they do start to see the way other people live. At the same time, of course, radio and TV signals are accessible in parts of Eastern Europe. And so even as they try to jam a lot of these signals and and not permit the people to purchase radio and TV sets that obtain these signals, they still the message was getting through, and so that I think was a part of it as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating that just even these little slivers of exposure to markets, we're not just trading goods and services, we're trading bits and pieces of our culture and our lifestyle. And that's kind of a bottom up way to change the minds of people that don't.
Absolutely,
Yeah. Um,
absolutely, and that's a beautiful way to put it. Yeah.
so one of the things I think we should talk about now is what what steps did they take to transition out of socialism? You refer to some of it as shock therapy, and you make references to the Washington Consensus. So, can you explain what those things are and kind of what role they played, and maybe the challenges that emerged through these methods?
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
maybe first we should talk about the Washington Consensus, and one point about the Washington Consensus is that it really was a consensus. A lot of people across the political spectrum agreed that some fundamental change had to happen. It was called the Washington Consensus because it was, Washington think tanks essentially promoted the idea, but also Washington-based institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And the basic elements of this were, okay, these countries, these former socialist countries, clearly they're going to need to liberalize, they're going to need to privatize. They should open up to trade. They need to substitute, uh, narrow spending and subsidies for firms, get rid of that, and instead have broad-based spending on public goods, have fiscal discipline, bring spending in line with taxes, have a broad tax base with generally lower marginal rates, market-determined interest rates, competitive exchange rates, um, open up to foreign direct investment, eliminate anti-competitive regulations, permit, and of course, permit private property and people to start their own businesses. So that's the basic idea of the Washington Consensus. I think it's actually fair to say it's kind of criticized sometimes today, but I think it's fair to say that it was not especially controversial at the time. And I think it's even more important to say that the empirical evidence for the Washington Consensus is very strong. So different countries embraced it to different degrees. There was quite a bit of debate about the speed of implementing these reforms. While almost everybody agreed we should do it, some countries were more inclined to take a gradualist approach, and others were more inclined to go head first. The critics called those who were plowing it head first, they called them shock therapists. They were administering shock therapy to the system, and this new experiment was maybe going to be worse than the old experiment. That was at least their claim. I hesitate to use the word experiment because for a couple of reasons. One, of course, the socialist regime was actually experimenting on people. They were forcing them to do things and not do things that they wanted. That was not their choice. So that's important. And then the other thing is that the polls themselves emphasized that they didn't want any more experiments. So the first non-communist prime minister of Poland, Mazowiecki, says that the long-term strategic goal of the government's activity should be to restore Poland's economic institutions. And he says, I understand by this a return to a market-oriented economy and a role for the state similar to that in economically developed countries. Quote, Poland cannot afford ideological experiments any longer. So from the perspective of the Poles, the Balcerowicz plan to plow ahead with going transitioning to a market economy, it was not an experiment. It was an end to a half-century experiment that had ended in disaster. And we were now going to allow people to make their own decisions.
And so one of the challenges it seems like Poland would have to face, or any country that is transitioning back to a market-oriented system from having a collective system would be you have to reprivatize the means of production, right? What was collectively owned by the state now is going to be put back into the hands of private actors. And that seems like that could be a very, very, very messy situation. How did Poland deal with that particularly messy problem?
Well, I think it's fair to say they've dealt with it in a pretty messy way. Almost all of former socialist states, it was a clumsy and messy way of privatization. And there were different strategies here. Some of them were to identify specific owners, where they would try or identify potential new owners and try to sell large state enterprises to those firms. That Let me back up. Small scale privatization in most countries worked reasonably well. If it was a small business that was, on the corner of a grocery store, often basically they just if it was typically the owner, the managers of the stores and the workers there, they were interested in buying it and they could just sell it to them. That happened relatively easily. It's these big conglomerates that were much harder. And one problem with the social system is it sort of had a problem of giganticism. Bigger was always better. If you compare the state firms in socialist economies, they were many, many times larger than the biggest companies in capitalist economies. That was harder. Okay, so you could identify one way to do it was to try to sell it to individuals. This was great if you needed somebody who had a Western manager who had a particular technical expertise. As you can imagine, though, there's criticism that this seemed to be, it wasn't very open or egalitarian. It basically kind of, you're channeling it to individual, well-connected people. Another way to do it was voucher privatization. This was championed by a lot of free market advocates. And with this, large numbers of people, maybe even the whole population, would get a little ownership of a firm, and they could then sell it. The problem with this, so this was much more of an open, non-privileged type of system, but you did often end up with fragmented ownership. So, in contrast that with the case where it's just a couple of competent managers from the West take it over, often the firm would end up in the hands of disparate people, and they didn't necessarily know how to run it. So the book we're writing on Estonia, frankly, Estonia did it a better way. They were quicker with it, and they kind of used a middle ground between these two systems, where they didn't have vouchers for everybody. They gave vouchers to the workers in the businesses, so that they kind of knew something about the business and then could use that to if they wanted to, they could take control of it and manage it. So Poland privatized, but it actually is kind of one of the things that they didn't do as well as others. They took a lot longer to do it. They had a mix of these privatization techniques, and it ended up being a much more drug out process than in other countries, unfortunately.
What are some of the other challenges that they face during this transition period?
So, one challenge is what the Hungarian economist János Kornai describes as a transformation recession, or a transformative recession. Every post-communist state went into one of these recessions. Poland's was quite deep. You can imagine the sort of reasons why. One, just take simple macroeconomics. You had rampant inflation, and they had to get a handle on that, and the only way you can do that is by raising interest rates to a more market-determined rate that's going to be much higher, and that leads to disinflationary pressures, and that's quite painful, as some people in Western societies are figuring out right now, right? So that's part of it. Another part of it is you had to reallocate large sectors of inputs. So, for for one thing, all this labor and capital had been channeled into heavy industry. That was always the emphasis, and it turned out people wanted, use our example from the previous conversation, they wanted feminine products. They didn't necessarily want 20-pound drills, right? And so, in order to reallocate all that labor and all that capital, people lost their jobs. And they had to figure out how to apply new skill sets. Another problem is firms were open to competition now. Now, one, I think, important and clever way that Poland really committed itself to a new direction was they pretty quickly lowered their trade barriers. And so one of the very first steps was to open up to foreign trade. Now, these firms not only had to compete with other Polish firms, but they had to compete with firms around the world. And if they didn't produce, then they were going to go out of business and they were going to be liquidated. So that's a challenge. Here are firms. To go back to our previous conversation, unemployment was essentially illegal. Everybody worked, but they didn't always produce. And firms could get away with producing very little of value, and now they were suddenly exposed to true competition. It did take a while even for culture to catch up as well. So throughout the former Soviet bloc, and you saw that whenever companies would advertise that they wanted help, they would say, as a requirement, they did not want you to have any previous experience in socialist management under the socialist system, because it was just known that they weren't very good managers. So a lot of that takes, frankly, quite a bit of time to work its way through. And unemployment skyrocketed. It was a deep recession, and it was a painful recession. There's just no way around it.
Good. So I'm glad you brought up this idea of kind of cultural factors, because one of the questions I was curious about is, what role informal institutions like culture would play in determining whether the transition back to markets is going to be a success, or if it's going to be, devolving into some corruption nightmare, where instead of having a centralized system of corruption, now you have decentralized corruption and you're paying bribes left and right, and the social trust that was eroded through the system of tattling on your neighbor constantly. What kind of challenges did they face culturally, in addition to the one that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so here's where culture and economics and institutions all are intertwined, and it's very hard, honestly, to kind of bring them out. Milton Friedman was once asked, what's the most important thing to do? What are the three most important things for a transition economy to do? And he said, privatize, privatize, privatize. Later, he said, privatize institutions, privatize. I think I would even amend it to say, privatize institutions and culture. You got to get all of these things right. And it's not super clear how you build a good culture. But it does seem to be that some former socialist countries, Poland and Estonia are the two that pop into my head, managed to build more of an entrepreneurial, or rely perhaps on their previous entrepreneurial culture much quicker than others. Part of this could be, if you think back all the way to Marx, he had this idea that there was a natural progress to history. And
Right.
so, you start with, there's these first two phases of
Like
sort of
primitive
primitive society.
socialism,
Yeah, exactly.
and then the
Exactly. But
imperial slave societies. Yeah.
exactly. And so for him, the key was you had to have feudalism, and then capitalism, and then socialism. But interestingly enough, the first socialist state had skipped over the capitalist part. Russia was not a capitalist industrialist society. It was a very feudal society still. And so I do think if you look at, compare countries like Poland and Estonia, they had a capitalist free enterprise system before they were taken over by the Soviets. The Estonians had a joke, how many five-year plans will it take before we are reduced to the same level of prosperity as the Russians. And so, uh, if you compare that those countries with Russia, for example, I think having had very little experience with genuine free enterprise, they had basically been a feudal society where the state directs things to a communist society where the state directs things. I think that's some of the reason why there wasn't some of the cultural prerequisites there.
That's really interesting to think about, because usually when people bring up the stages of history that we have to go through um, to get towards socialism, they bring it up as a kind of a justification of, well, that foray into socialism failed because it wasn't truly what Marx thought we should be doing. You're skipping steps, and so um, it's interesting to think about going through that capitalist phase before entering into socialism was actually really important to being able to go back to markets.
Yeah.
That I had
Yep.
never thought about it that way before. Um, so I want to think a little bit about, what does Poland look like, now and post that transition. You point out that their standard of living rose quite rapidly, like twice as fast as it was as growing under socialism. And that's really amazing growth. What do they look like in the immediate aftermath? What do they look like today?
Yes. So, some of these figures, if your listeners have a chance to check out the book, it's free online at the Fraser Institute. Uh, if you look at only one page, I'd love you to look at all the pages, but if you look at one page, look at page 75. And there on figure 4.6 on page 75, we show the trajectory of real per capita GDP. So what this is the productivity of the typical person, and therefore the income of the typical person. And it's tightly correlated with what people produce is very, very tightly correlated with what they can earn. So in 1970, this is adjusting for inflation. These are 2017 dollars. In 1970, the typical Pole was earning about $5,000, a little bit over. Um, by 1991, they were earning $8,000. At that same pace, today they'd be earning 14,000 if nothing had changed. But instead, because of the changes that happened around 1991, the growth rate more than doubled, and now they're earning 31,000. So twice as high earnings as they otherwise would have if they had stayed on that same path that they had been on for 20 years. So, huge difference. You may have seen there was a headline in the Telegraph, the British newspaper, a few months ago, saying that Poland will be wealthier than Britain by 2030. And so on this path, they're on their way, if trends continue, to overtaking, historically the wealthiest country in the world, right? And so this not only led to increase in income, which of course allowed them to buy, nice gadgets and trinkets of capitalist society, but it also changed, their lives. So if you look at lifespan, it shows a very, very similar trend. So from 1970 to 1991, the average Pole, his life expectancy rose from 69.8 years to 70.6 years. So over that 20-year period, they gained less than a year in life expectancy. Pretty dismal considering what the 20th century's record in terms of increases in life expectancy. But from 1991 onward, it's been a totally different story. So if they'd stayed on that same path, today Poles would be expected to live about 71 and a half years. Instead, the average Pole can expect to live almost 78 years. So, an increase of 7 extra years of life as a result of greater prosperity. So, when we talk about the value of markets and the value of prosperity, it's not just that we get to buy more trinkets, we get to buy more time on the planet. And that's, extraordinarily valuable.
Right. Bob Lawson always says, it's the different that those extra years are the difference between knowing your grandchildren and never knowing your grandchildren. And those are really meaningful improvements in the quality of life that we are able to live.
Yeah,
Um,
that's absolutely. Yeah.
what lessons should we take away from Poland's experience with transition? If a country like Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea was thinking of we've done this collective experiment for long enough, let's transition to markets. What kind of advice would they be able to take away from Poland's experience?
So I think a very important lesson, and it's really in the empirical literature, it's extremely well supported by lots of studies, is that if you're going to do something difficult, and this is difficult, let's no bones about it, it's a very difficult to transition. The worst thing you could do is drag it on. It's the best is to just go and as Estonia's Prime Minister Mart Laar put it, just do it. To liberalize prices, to privatize, to get the monetary policy right and fiscal policy right, to introduce private property rights, all of that is, and competition, and open yourself up to competition. It's not easy, but it's very clear that those countries like Poland and Estonia that were increased economic freedom faster and more significantly and across a wider swath of their economies, they fared better. Those transition economies that were the slow pokes, they still are struggling. So part of the problem here is it goes back to this idea that privilege is a trap. So the pathology of privilege, which we talked about in our last conversation, this is the system where certain firms and certain members of society are favored and privileged. They're going to fight to keep those privileges. And it's a bit of a trap. The famous political economist Gordon Tullock called this the transitional gains trap. He wasn't even talking about transitioning out of a socialist economy. He was talking about simple things like deregulating taxi companies. And he was pointing out, it's very, very difficult to do because these privileged groups, they actually don't even benefit over the long run because the system is so inefficient. But they stand to lose if they're suddenly opened up to, exposed to competition from the outside world. So they're going to fight like crazy to hang on to their privileges, even though their privileges aren't that lucrative. So that is a very difficult problem. And honestly, there's really only two ways you can, two lessons from it. One is don't get yourself into the trap. And then two, if you find yourself in the trap, get out of it as quickly as you can. The slow, painful, or the slow gradual transition is unfortunately more painful than a quick one.
And those people who were enjoying their privileges and have political connections would undoubtedly have extra time to figure out how to benefit from the new system and structure it to their own advantages. I have one question that I want to ask about related to, what would you tell people, maybe younger people today who are enamored with the idea of socialism? Kind of what lessons would you impart to them through what you've learned about Poland's experience? And kind of related to that, given kind of the advancements in technology today, the fact that we have big data and we have AI tools and we have really powerful algorithms, right? I know some of my students are tempted to say, well, why can't we try this socialist experiment again and we'll do it better this time because we have better tools to solve the knowledge problem? I know those are big questions, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on them.
Yeah, they're great questions. So again, to go back to the knowledge problem, the specific knowledge that we're talking about, it's not necessarily technical knowledge of how to make a computer or a machine. As the Soviets managed to split the atom, right? They managed to get a man in space. They managed to dig the White Sea Canal at the cost of 25,000 human lives, but they did it. It's not a technical question. It's a question of what do people want? And the only way to really understand that is to allow the market process to work out and allow markets as a discovery procedure so that we can see what people want. And if you try to centrally direct an economy, you end up with white sea canals. You end up with huge industrial investment in gigantic firms, and you end up with no feminine hygiene products. That is essentially, what the socialist system teaches us. So there's no amount of computers or technological knowledge that's going to help us get out of that problem. And also, that's not the only problem. You also have the incentive problem and the control problem, and those loom large as well. So I think that's what I would try to say to your students. It is I think it's one of the happy accidents of life that freedom not only is a philosophically appealing concept, it's also an economically valuable commodity. Economically free people are prosperous people. We have so much data to support this. We have so much theory to support this. We don't need to be casting about for some new grand socialist scheme. We just need to let people be free and they will prosper. So that's kind of the first thing I would say. And then your other question, I think, is really valid too, is, why are we forgetting? What do we say to people who don't know? Here's the lesson I would try to impart. So personally, I was doing a little bit of math and looking at the dates here. I realized that I was born about 3.5 decades after Hitler took his life. And that time span is exactly the time span we are now after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was fortunate that nobody in the previous generation in any way obscured the truth of Hitler. I knew exactly what National Socialism under Hitler was about. I knew about all of the depravities of that social experiment. I think it behooves us to make sure that the next generation understands all of the tragedies that happened with the socialist experiment as well. We need to make sure, especially those of us who remember it or have glimmers of a memory of it, watching as kids around the TV, that humans wanted to be free. They yearned to be free. And it was young people, especially, who brought about the change in these countries. It was people who had Václav Havel, ended up being, the first prime minister of Czechoslovakia, and he was inspired in part because he saw people being repressed who were trying to, play music. So we need to remember that a lot of the change was brought about by young people yearning to be free. It's an extraordinarily inspiring story in many ways.
Well, Matt, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask, in addition to the book that we've been talking about today, are there other books or podcasts or academic papers that you might recommend to listeners who really want to dig in and learn more about these ideas?
That's great. So thank you for that opportunity. So one, this is part of a broader project called The Realities of Socialism. We've got several books that are in various stages. The next one that Pete and Constantine and I are going to be producing is it'll be out in a couple months, is on Estonia. If the Poland story is inspiring, the Estonian story is even more inspiring, I think. We also have, there's other books around Denmark and Sweden, two examples of countries that are not socialist, but people perceive them as being socialist. And Singapore, which is, again, not socialist, but it offers a very interesting model. So I recommend that. We've got a whole lot of materials, supplementary materials that people can check out, infographics and videos. A couple of books, I suppose, to really understand the system and the totalitarian state. I don't know how to pronounce his name, Orlando. I think it's Fegis. He's a beautiful writer, and he's got some really powerful books. One called The Whisperers that talks about what it's like to live in a totalitarian state. I very much recommend that. Anne Applebaum has a wonderful book about the Iron Curtain and what life was like. And then I would also recommend Timothy, I think it's Snyder, has a book called The Bloodlands that has a very interesting comparison and contrast between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and how the two systems clashed and collaborated and interacted with each other in a way to just devastate such a beautiful land and such beautiful cultures for decades. So it's a tragedy, but it's something that we all should better understand. I might end on one note. It's kind of an ironic, sad tragedy. So do you remember when we were first talking about how this happened, how Poland transitioned? I talked about Anna Walatinowicz.
Yeah,
She was the heroic worker. Well, the Soviets, when they invaded Poland, one of the many tragedies was what's known as the Katyn massacre, and they murdered about 15,000 prisoners of war, Polish prisoners of war, and buried them in the forests of Katyn, and then of course denied it for several decades. You may remember in 2010 there was a plane crash in Poland, and the president of Poland was on the plane. There were several Polish dignitaries and famous Poles. They were on their way to commemorate the Katyn massacre. Anna Walatinowicz lost her life on that plane crash. So in some ways, so we dedicate the book to her because she is in some ways one of the last victims of the Katyn massacre.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, for sharing your time and your knowledge with me and with people who are listening. You've painted a very vivid picture of the hardships that people endured under the system of socialism, but you've also given us a pretty hopeful picture about, the potential to, transition to something more economically free that can unleash our ability to flourish as human beings. So I found this conversation incredibly informative, and I hope that listeners have as well. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I always enjoy chatting with you.
Thanks for joining us for the Realities of Socialism podcast, where we take a deep dive into the consequences of socialism as it was imposed on tens of millions of people during the 20th century. For more information, including infographics, free books, and more podcast episodes, visit realitiesof socialism.org.